So, welcome everyone. Just want to say we have updated our website for kind of the next speakers in this series. So it's a real pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Jon Peterson. He's an author, game historian, collector, and archivist. And he wrote a bunch of books, among one of them his recent book, Playing at the World, which gives a history of war games and also role-playing games. He gives frequent talks, such as today, and writes a lot on the history of games. And one of the things he's particularly interested in is actually what predates our digital games. So if you think about computer games and simulations, you may know there are board games, card games that have existed way beyond that and before that, and that kind of provide inspiration of what we see today. And so it's a pleasure to hear his talk called The Long Now of Gaming. Welcome.
Thanks, and thanks for having me. And I apologize in advance if I seem a bit jet lagged. I just got back from Germany, actually. I was on Friday, I was in Ulm in Germany, in part to visit with this fellow that you see here. This is the Lion Mensch, and it's one of the earliest representations we have that we believe were created by humans that were figural representations, representing really anything recognizable. As you can see, it's an image that looks like it's a lion. It's apparently based on the cave lions that were now extinct, that were common in the part of Germany where this was found. But it seems to be kind of upright, like a person that just happens to have a lion head, a form that we would call theriocephalic in early art, familiar from Egyptian gods and things like that. And it's 40,000 years old. When we talk about things that are old, we can't even imagine who the people were that made this, or why they made it, or what it meant to them. Did they think this was something real in some sense? Did they think they could encounter this out in the forests 40,000 years ago? Was this purely an artistic creation that they thought looked nice? Or was it a god that lived in some kind of other world that they were interested in? We don't really know, but I'm personally fascinated by the earliest ways that humanity tried to imagine or to experience the unreal. And so this is a real linchpin for me, because I study a more recent way that people tried to experience the unreal. The focal point of my research is the game Dungeons and Dragons, which came out in this original form in 1974. It was made by a small company in rural Wisconsin, made up of 3 guys who the company could not hope to even employ, who put out these box sets with 3 booklets inside of them, and instigated a revolution. It created a whole new genre of games. And one of the reasons I'm so fascinated by Dungeons and Dragons is because it's clear that so much of our computer game culture, which has become something rather significant actually in the last 30 years, really began with what we see in Dungeons and Dragons. And it incorporates principles of simulation that go back way into history, incorporates mythology that goes back way into history. And the middle booklet down there, the booklet that's called Monsters and Treasure, you can see a little dragon on the cover of it. So when I think about things like the Lion Man, I'm also thinking about things like dragons that go back to Assyrian art, or back really to the earliest stories that we have that are preserved by language. We can find dragons in them. And D&D taps into something related to those we don't quite understand yet. And I'm not going to tell you that I understand. I don't think anybody understands it yet. But I think we're poking around some really interesting historical territory when we look at the ways that people experience and interact with the unreal. But it isn't just things like monsters that show how far back the roots of gaming go. When we talk about old school gaming, people talk about an old school renaissance a lot these days, who play these tabletop games kind of defiantly in the face of the more commercial, popular computer game culture. For me, the real moment that hit me, that got me started down the path to writing the book, Playing at the World, I was at the British Museum in 2005. A game called World of Warcraft had just come out the previous November. Pretty much from when that came out, I stopped doing everything else I was supposed to do in life, and it was just playing World of Warcraft. But some friends of mine dragged me to England to go actually to a rock festival in February. While I was there, I was at the British Museum, and I saw this first century AD Roman gaming die covered with Greek letters. For people who follow these things online, there are many pictures of these things that you see periodically surfacing as people talk about how early kind of these implements of chance go back. But for me, it was really a a kind of transformational moment. That is actually literally the picture I took, by the way, in 2005 with whatever primitive digital camera I had before I had an iPhone. That I went home and looked up those catalog numbers and tried to learn what I could about the dice that were being shown there, because it brought me to the question of how far back everything goes. And kind of like the Lion Mensch, no one really knows what these dice were for. They're covered with Greek letters. We don't know if they were used for gambling, if they were used for divination. There's this great divide kind of between what we now think of as the D20 that we use to roll a 2-hit in Dungeons and Dragons and these ancient implements. But seeing how far they go lets us ask questions about now and how long the long now is. How long is now? It's a Smiths song, right? How long is now? Since games have become such a big deal in the last 30 years, I guess I've felt that games culture has an overlooked place in intellectual history. It's not just pop culture fads. It's not just business ventures that succeeded or failed. These are fundamental breakthroughs in simulation, in probability, in methods of education, varieties of interactions with literature that I'll be discussing. And for me, the history of gaming is really about this remarkable transition of ideas. We don't always see the linkages. We aren't always able to divine how we got from that first century ID Roman 20-sided die to the dice of today. The process is often rhizomatic, right? In the sense of lots of independent people are inventing ideas and they're all kind of boiling up simultaneously. As far as I can tell, the D20 usage that we see in Dungeons and Dragons and related games really only dates back to the 1960s, like barely. And a lot of this had to do with the company right here in Palo Alto that was called Creative Publications, that was publishing all of the Platonic solids as dice for educational purposes. They put out these nice booklets that kids, really like preschoolers, would go through, and you'd be able to roll the dice and you'd learn about numbers from doing so. And it was from a catalog that contained those dice that people who were looking for implements of chance, who understood probability and statistics, wanted to be able to model events in a game world, kind of adopted those. In ignorance of whatever it was that originally inspired the dice that we see in antiquity. But I mean, I guess my central thesis here today is really going to be that the key breakthroughs of gaming will be with us for a long time, and that we're still really in the infancy of a transformation that was catalyzed by the publication of D&D in the 1970s. But D&D, of course, merely concentrated like a prism, a whole set of trajectories in intellectual history that were combined in a very felicitous and successful way, and that ended up inspiring a whole lot of subsequent work. And I feel like I need to do this because I think so many of us, when we think about gaming, our gaming culture today, we think about it as being a product really just of the 1970s. And it's true, the 70s were pretty interesting times for games. Right here at Stanford, actually, I've shown this slide at a couple places before, but I stuck in that 1971 Galaxy game there at the far left in the bottom. Though, honestly, as far as I can tell, really computer space, we want to get technical, came out because you could play it at like trade shows in October of 1971. Probably the Galaxy game wasn't at the Trester Student Union here until November of 1971. Let's not split hairs. We're at Stanford. It came first. But really, we've got this huge concentration of revolutionary things that happened in the 70s. We have computer space. We have the Odyssey, the Magnavox Odyssey, which brought this to the home television in 1972. We've got Pong in 72, following hard upon both the innovations before it. And of course, we've got D&D, which I personally feel had a big role to play in the story that followed. And then personal computing came right on the heels of that. I could have the Altair and other things, but between the Apple and D&D here, but you get the picture. And by 1978, we have recognizable arcade culture. We have things like Space Invaders, which could be seen as a combination of computer space and Breakout. That's how I've always looked at Space Invaders. But right already by that point, we were combining these elements and taking them into new directions and new places. So it was a fascinating time, but it's hardly the beginning of like popular gaming. If you really want to go back to when the gaming hobby started, for me, I think probably gaming as entertainment, where you're trying to simulate conflict, do the things that are familiar to us from computer games, probably began in 1913 with the publication of Little Wars. When I talked about how these games all intersect a lot with history, Interestingly, there was a fellow named H.G. Wells, famous for a number of science fiction books that he published in the 1890s and early 20th century. He was the real protagonist behind Little Wars. Little Wars was his attempt to take these toy soldiers that were then present in every English nursery made by a company called Britons, actually, a very patriotic name for toy soldiers, and figure out how to purpose them into an organized, competitive conflict. And his kind of seminal vision was, well, I can sell this as a commercial product, this book of rules that uses those toy soldiers, and market that as a game to people from adolescents, not very young children, but all the way up through adulthood. And as you can see in this contemporary depiction from Little Wars, he really imagined that grown men would be down on their hands and knees maneuvering around these toy soldiers. They had little cannons that shot wooden dowels that could knock the soldiers over at a distance. And he wasn't the only one who was doing this at the time. Robert Louis Stevenson, in the 1880s, when he was, he had terrible health problems, and he spent some time for health reasons in Davos, where the air is very thin. There were a number of kind of sanitariums there. Famously, in his attic in Davos in 1881, he played a number of these games with his young stepson. And Wells certainly, in part, works off of Stevenson's accounts. There are other writers like Fletcher Pratt, who is a New York intellectual who was connected with a number of the science fiction writers there, who ran a famous naval game before the Second World War. The thing when we look at Little Wars, part of the reason why we're reluctant to say gaming really began then is because, unfortunately, Little Wars came out right on the cusp of the First World War. And Wells was a pacifist. He strongly believed that playing at Little Wars would teach everyone what a horrible thing Great War was, right? That no one would do it anymore once you had these Little Wars out there. Well, it turned out it was not particularly timely to release a book that had that thesis in 1913. So the check was in the mail for a bit. It really didn't take until the 1950s that we began to see a hobby of gaming emerging in the United States and in England. These particular gamers here are kind of indicative of the gamers of the 1960s. They're in their basement. They have a huge sprawling table that they've meticulously designed this beautiful terrain for. And this was the graphics, right, of the pre-computer era, when you would go out of your way to design these beautiful terrains and arrange all of your miniatures, which you would meticulously paint. Some would make the miniatures themselves. And this is an interesting picture because it actually features one of the co-creators of Dungeons & Dragons. The third fellow from the right there with his elbows on the table is Dave Arneson. This was 1966 in the basement of that fellow Dave Wesley, who's on the far left there, who was famous for creating a game called Brownstein, which was one of the very early kind of role-playing games that inspired later work in D&D. But, even Wells was reacting to an existing tradition of war games. What Wells really contributed was to strip this down to be an entertainment product. But of course, the principles of simulation had been around by this point for a fairly long time. Once you had rudimentary control of probability and statistics, it became possible to simulate fictional events by deciding how likely it was they would occur, and then consulting some implement of chance, like, say, rolling a die and saying, okay, if it fell within the necessary range of probability, then that fictional event happened in the course of the game. And this was something that was designed by Prussian military scientists in the early 19th century, most important of whom was Reiswitz, as a means of training officers. They wanted the officers to be able to get a sense of the same uncertainty that they would face actually commanding troops in combat. Because he thought that was the only way you could really learn. He didn't want them to think like you think in chess, where in chess it's always obvious. Like if you move a knight, you know what's going to happen. You might not know what's going to happen several moves later, but your knight is either going to take the piece that there's no uncertainty about the knight taking the piece that you're trying to take. If the knight can take the pawn, then the knight takes the pawn. There's no die roll you do. There's no uncertainty about it. But we all know that, in warfare, weird things happen. And at Agincourt, it rained that day, and the French cavalry got bogged down, and the Welsh archers, did the mint, right? All kinds of weird contingencies affect battle. So it's always has to have some uncertainty to it. And so they started building these combat resolution tables, where they would roll dice and they would say what the results of these rolls would be. This is actually taken from a later English imitation of these German Kriegspiels. This one is from Baring, the famous Aldershot rules that were developed for Aldershot for the English military. And you can see in this that there are a number of options that result from various die rolls. It all depends. You can see the pips of the dice at the top. And then these are all kind of odds-based, depending on how bad your odds are. You can kind of see the 3 to 1, 2 to 1, things like that along it. Depending on how bad your odds are, you'll have a worse chance of being able to defeat the enemy. You might, in fact, be repulsed, or you might destroy the enemy, or you might totally destroy them. Combat result tables like this became very, very influential, became a signature of all the board wargaming that was created by people like Avalon Hill that followed, and really was brought wholesale into Dungeons & Dragons as well in a slightly more sophisticated form. But, take a little sip of water here. One of the most interesting things about these principles of simulation is that they began to merge with the weapons of war themselves. This wasn't really true in Reiswitz's time, right? In 1824, kind of in the Napoleonic War era, you had cannons, you had guns. Basically, you had your troops show up at a battlefield, and they could see each other, and they could shoot each other. It was pretty much line of sight shooting. Let's wind the clock forward a little bit. Say to Jutland, to 1916, to a time when you've got ships that are out in the North Atlantic or in the Baltic, that are actually shooting from a moving target at a moving target, where they need to make very intense calculations to figure out whether or not you can hit what you're aiming for. The power of cordite and steel at this point completely overwhelmed the mathematical and computational capabilities of the people who were implementing the weapons themselves. And so you can kind of think about it like the war came down to not who had the bigger gun, but who could really do better math. And this mathematical models, the models that were developed to be able to figure out, like at Jutland, where you now had guns that could shoot 9 nautical miles away. So in other words, if you are standing looking across the waterline from your ship, your pinky finger could entirely obscure a dreadnought at this distance. There's virtually no prospect for you to try line of sight to do that. It had to be people who were down in the bowels of the ship using tools like Dumaresques and all kinds of primitive analog firing computers that were used to ascertain ships' positions. They were building a model of combat down there. And like any model, this model could be exercised to represent real things or to represent fantastic things. In some sense, they were playing this computer game. Although, of course, they didn't have really a computer as such. So I would say that before there were computer games, there were these computed games that people had to do the computation for without the computer to do it for them. And, people tried to make it a little bit easier to do these computations. This is from Livermore's American Art of War in 1881. And this represents state-of-the-art computing in 1881. You want to get a sense of how far back things we might even consider computing go. Because you can see there's something here, it's called a computing table that's on the left. And then all these kind of tallies of losses. These tallies of losses are where state was kept in this game. And the computing table is where you would ascertain the results of firing a shot. It's actually a table of logarithms. And the way this table of logarithms works, through various contingencies and modifications, you'll get instructions, okay, if the person you're trying to shoot, is under cover, well, that means that, you need to move 3 steps back on this table from where you started. But if it then turns out that your riflemen are more experienced than your target, well, then you get to move 6 steps forward. And at the end of the day, you end up with the result from that of how many casualties will be realized. But doing the actual math to perform that yourself became so prohibitively complicated, they needed to give you this computer. It has its rulers on the side that you would use to measure the distances. This is kind of your one-stop shop to be able to adjudicate an extremely complex war game based on all these principles of computation in the late 19th century. And I'm absolutely fascinated by things like this, by the early computing aids and the way that we tried to get a deeper level of simulation, a deeper model that let us represent these worlds of conflict in games before we had access to the fancy tools that we had as of the 1970s. And I kind of break this down mentally into two cultures of games that began to emerge in the 19th century. Kind of these kinetic games and these computed games. You can see these gentlemen here on the right meditating over this game, having this deep cerebral experience of Victorian gaming on their table with its topographic and topological differences and surely Dyson tables that were governing everything that happened. And then what we see on the left there is a Bagatelle table, precursor to pinball. And the Bagatelle table is really a case where you let nature do your computing for you. It's much more immediate, much more visceral, satisfying in a very different way. What we think of as the arcade game tradition of gaming, we might look at these kinetic games and say that is where that trajectory began, that culture began. I kind of almost look at this as an Apollonian versus Dionysian approach to this, where the Dionysian is the kinetic, the computed is the Apollonian. And inevitably, of course, computers would enable us to close this gap. But for the longest time, these kind of existed as parallel activities throughout the 20th century. Oh, and just as an aside, it's worth mentioning that this, anytime I have to show one Bagatelle table, then I have to go into the long now. Well, it turns out, of course, this goes back. It has its own whole tradition. Obviously, these Bagatelle games depended on billiards. We can show people doing table billiards in 1830. And of course, before they were doing table billiards, they were doing ground billiards. I've read actually this is connected, interestingly enough, to fertility rights originally. That these ground billiard games where you had to have a stick and you'd hit a ball and it would go into a hole. Not that there's any symbolism, anything like that, but there are people really who study this that have made this argument, and apparently it is connected to all kinds of ecclesiastical activities that kind of were imported into Christianity from various pagan rites that existed before. Off topic for us today, but still fascinating. Even when you design something like a Bagatelle table, though, when you look at the table in my previous slide, you still need to have done a certain amount of the computing beforehand to figure out how balls work and where they'll bounce. And it wasn't just intuition. By 1807, people had really started to study this and to understand this well, mostly because people gambled on these things. The same is true of dice. The only reason we really have probability and statistics like we do is because Fermat and people like that were extremely concerned about figuring out how to do fair wagers with dice, and all of the groundwork for this was laid by that. And these games, these kinetic games, really fascinate me to look at kind of the mid-20th century Apollonian and Dionysian approaches to this. There's a great place here in San Francisco that's called the Muse Mechanique. Does anybody here been there? People know this? Most people? If you have not been there, please go. Please go. You can. These pictures actually took them there. You get to experience kind of how people approached these simulations before the digital era, largely working off the principles of things like pinball. There's a baseball game you see here on the left that takes the same metal balls, the ball bearings that you shoot around in pinball, and is instead tasked them to keeping a baseball game that keeps careful score and state and so on. And many of these games even have individual teams represented with individual batters who are named. You'll go through the roster. I mean, it's very interesting how detailed these games were. And as I've studied more and more about these kind of analog, just before digital arcade games, you learn a tremendous amount about the levels of sophistication that are available through analog computing. And then, of course, these then kind of competed for mindshare with games like Stratomatic, which was the seminal baseball simulation game, which every year they would publish cards for all the players and all the various teams, and you'd be able to, it's kind of the early fantasy baseball sort of game. People loved this game. People ate it up at the time. And you see this across the board, all these game genres that I think we might be tempted to think are kind of computer game genres, things like these sports simulations, things like racing games. It's phenomenal to play this game like this Road Racer, where it's played actually on a drum, and the drum rotates. So when you kind of think of a vertical scroller computer game, the vertical scroller computer game is really just based on how this drum moves this way. You've got a little car that's on a stick that dangles down, and your steering wheel lets you move this car kind of laterally and turn it along these ways. Your job is to keep it on this road as the road changes, as this drum keeps rolling. absolutely essential, I think, to understanding where the video game traditions came from, to see what the analog implementations of them were. But equally important to look at games like Le Mans, which is an early Avalon Hill game that has a racing simulation itself, because it's the computations that were behind this that would ultimately be executed by the computers to create something that gives you this visceral feeling. So when I talk about how the computers and the analog trends would eventually merge in the 70s, that's where we're going with that. All right, so this is the interactive portion of our discussion. There's a quiz time. So in 1962, there was a really novel game. And at the time, it was only known to a small and dedicated group of hobbyists. It was played with 2 ships. Each ship was controlled by a player. They maneuver around in a flat, two-dimensional space. As a controller of one ship, you can try to torpedo the other ship. You have a limited number of torpedoes, but if you manage to hit with the torpedo, you win. So 1962. Who knows what this game is? So Battleship had been around for a long time by 1962. And in Battleship, you have several ships, and you aren't really maneuvering them around, actually. You decide where they are when you start out, and you kind of have to guess. I find Battleship a fascinating game, too. I wouldn't say that you really have the same kind of torpedoes, and I wouldn't say that was only known to a dedicated group of hobbyists. This was a Milton Bradley game in 1959 that sold millions and millions of copies. I'm talking about something that was experienced by just a few thousand hobbyists then. You know, ordinarily, everyone says, oh, obviously he's talking about Space War, which of course I'm not. I'm talking about a game called U-Boat. Okay, my joke didn't work here. It is kind of a joke answer. So Space War obviously is a tremendously important computer game I'm going to talk about in a moment. But the point I wanted to make about games like Space War is that this game, U-Boat, which came out in 1959, that was reissued in 1962, has all the properties that we associate with a ship-to-ship combat game where you shoot torpedoes and your job is to have one ship sink the other. But what I want to say is, of course, when we look at these computer games, it is crucial to understand what kinds of analog games were out at the time that cut so close to the principles that they pioneered. So yeah, Space War obviously came out of MIT in 1962. It was playable, very highly computed. You know, you could say it beats Wells at his game. You know, in H.G. Wells's Little Wars, you would shoot your little analog cannon, right? Your little analog cannon would knock over the enemy troops. Here was a case where, again, it's your aim, your accuracy with the ship that you control in this space duel determines whether or not you're going to win. I think there's a number of different fandoms, and I'm going to talk about fandoms here in a bit, that intersected to help create this game of Space War. And I'd like to say that there was also a Space War board game at MIT in the 1960s, which is something I'm currently doing research on that I'll be writing about soon, that I think is tremendously exciting, to show even more so how Space War and this board war game culture were interacting at the time. And you know, Space War, it isn't just one game. Space War came out in 1962 in its initial iteration. It was here at Stanford within about a year. Actually, one of the principal designers of it went from MIT to Stanford then. And on the PDP-1 system here in Stanford, it was widely played. And that is indeed what led to the Galaxy game that I mentioned earlier, ultimately by 1971. But by that point, Space War was a whole family of games that had radically different properties. And people like Stuart Brand, who came and studied what we're doing here at Stanford then, you know, really captured the diversity of gaming that Space War had come to represent. But even when we look at that, you know, I need to show a timeline and say, sure, Space War, okay, unlike U-Boat, it's a science fiction game. And we tend to think that a lot of the early computer games were science fiction games. And it's kind of natural that people who were interested in science fiction were also interested in computers. There had to be some overlap in those communities. But I'm really fascinated by the whole tradition of science fiction tabletop games that surrounded this and the various innovations that they ended up introducing. This game, Interplanetary, 1943, which was created by a gentleman named Art Widner up in Boston, is, as far as I can tell, the first attempt by hobbyists to take the science fiction games they loved, in his case, largely Lensman, the Doc Smith Lensman stories, which is, if you don't know them, kind of swashbuckling, outer space, daring do sorts of adventures, and to try to turn this into a strategy game with ship-to-ship combat and everything else as you mine resources out in the universe. And in some respects, it anticipates what we now call the 4X genre of games, where we kind of have to go out to planets close to Earth and mine resources there in order to be able to move on to get to the next stage of it. Overlooked stuff that really, really requires more attention. You'll find, actually, a lot of the talks I give, I'm really saying there's a lot more work to be done. And it'd be great if somebody did it. I'm trying to do what I can, but really there's a ton more to be done. And I'm fascinated by science fiction fandom and by just the enthusiasm of the hobbyists who attack these problems. And we see the pattern of science fiction fandom repeated, again, for games fandom in the 1950s and then for computer fandom in the 1970s. And 20th century fandom is now something we kind of have to look at as an anachronism, right? If fans today express themselves through the internet and the fan communities organize themselves on the internet, and it's really a very different world from the world of the fandoms of the 20th century, where small clubs formed, like the Futurians and clubs like that were the foundational organizations of science fiction fandom in the 1930s, or the games groups, these groups of maybe 20 or 30 local gamers that would get together and circulate a fanzine, share ideas. They would have conventions. They'd be breaking out the party hats if 100 people showed up to one of these conventions and were just able to play some games, share some ideas. They all wanted to participate in design, although there were commercial entities that were producing games, for example, in the 1950s. Everybody wanted in on it. It wasn't enough to just experience these things. You wanted to get involved in the design. You wanted to be one of the protagonists in this. That's one of the defining qualities of fandoms. And computer fandom inherited all of these things from the previous fandoms before it. And let's face it, there was so much overlap between science fiction fans and computer fans. It was almost inevitable that science fiction and computer games would kind of evolve in parallel in the 1960s. In the university environments where people actually had access to computers, most gamers outside of universities didn't, at least not for recreational purposes. You'd find a lot of educated people that were interested in science fiction. You'll find a number of titles here that were crucial to the 4X genre. Games like War of the Empires, which Gary Gygax had a large role in developing. Games like Galaxy and Empire, which are fascinating play-by-mail games that, again, have this notion of expanding, exterminating other races, doing what you can to exploit planets that you find. Stellar Conquest is where people who write about the history of science fiction games, as far as I can tell, typically pick up in 1974. There's like 30 years of material that precedes that I think is just rife for study and for research and for writing. I think it's fascinating material with that. And we see games like Civilization borrow very, very heavily on these precedents. And of course, Civilization, which we all know is a computer game, started out as a board game. Started out as a Heartland Trefoil game in 1980 in England, and was then purchased by Avalon Hill. Avalon Hill put out its Civilization and Advanced Civilization board games. Sid Meier is not always so straightforward, I guess, about the debt that his games may have owed to this, but if you have them and you look at them, it's pretty clear what the situation is. And everybody's always like that. I studied the history of games a lot. No one is ever willing to concede that they were influenced by everything. I talked to Gary Gygax. All Gary Gygax ever told me when he was still alive was how he made everything up out of whole cloth, off the top of his head. Nothing influenced him before it. But these people, these fans of these games, are the community that created Dungeons and Dragons and were so influential on early computer games. And indeed, for people who like this term geek culture, it's not something that I'm super fond of myself. I think we see a merger, really, of the science fiction fandom, computer fandom, and games fandom that came to its head in the early 1970s and created the ideal conditions for entering the dungeon, coming to the 1970s. There's actually supposed to be a picture here that I guess fell off of my slide somehow. But it was going to be this beautiful picture that is from Domesday Book number 13 that shows Dave Arneson's personal map of a town called Blackmore. Dave Arneson was one of the co-creators of Dungeons & Dragons, and Blackmoor Castle was the place that had dungeons beneath it, which Mr. Arneson decided, it'd be a really cool thing to have people like come and adventure in these dungeons that are below Blackmoor Castle. I'm really not sure how that did not end up on my slide. Is it like hidden here? No, I don't think it is. You're gonna have to take my word for it. It's not a picture like of the dungeon, it's just a picture of the town of Blackmoor. I have it up online in various places. If you're really, really interested, come to me afterwards and I'll talk a bit about it. But really, I just wanted that there to tee up the notion that D&D, as I showed in that earlier timeline, appearing in 1974 in this culture that had merged, right, from science fiction fandom, from analog gaming, and then from computers, necessarily, because it brought so many of those people together itself. There were so many kind of science fiction and fantasy fans who weren't necessarily gamers, but as soon as D&D came out, suddenly there was something different. Suddenly, your game could now be about a story. And that dimension of the game created this even more radical unification of those fandoms. And because of that, when we look at D&D and we ask where D&D influenced computer games, it's hard to say like where it didn't. I mean, really anywhere that games track quantified health, like you have hit points, like, the Street Fighter health bar, anything like that. The reason why it's there goes back to the principles of simulation that D&D popularized. Now, of course, I could point to right switch showing points of damage and things like that in the early 19th century, but that had largely been forgotten. As I said, so much is rediscovered, so much is rhizomatic in the way that these things emerge. This was something that was really disruptive to the people who first saw it in D&D, who were just growing up at the time, who were high school students, college students. This idea of quantified damage was remarkable, let alone the idea that you have a character who improves with experience, who can level up. I mean, how much of our culture today, when we say the word gamification, which we now say all the time, really it's talking about this idea of garnering experience and leveling up and the incentives that creates. They tapped into something that was so radical with that. And it's what all the early reviewers, when you look at things from 1974 and 1975, it's the one thing that people single out and say, this is what made D&D what it is. This is what I just have never, I have a continuous character. I play in one session, but I'm coming back next time, and I'm going to kind of pick up where I left off with the same treasure, with the same experience, with the same new powers, and this is going to continue potentially forever. There's no win condition. There's just this eternal struggle. People just never seen a story, an open-ended story like that you could play through a game. Anywhere that you explore a world, anywhere there's like a secret world, whether it's something narrow like in a dungeon, or something as broad as the world of Warcraft, where you discover new areas and new areas of the map are revealed as you do, owes back to this. And yeah, most significantly, anywhere that the game tells a story. The earliest people who played D&D loved to write up their game reports. Now we all know, if anybody here plays D&D, or worse yet, knows people who play D&D. The one thing you don't want to do is like hear about other people's characters, because everyone really wants to tell you about their character and how awesome their character's adventure was, and that time that they fought that demi-lich, and you'd never believe it because it came down to this one. It's, but people use this actually to write up quite interesting stories. And you see this in the fanzines, which were kind of, again, the internet of the day, the blog posts of the day. You see how people describe their experiences and how radical it was to think about these things like a game is a story. And it wasn't long, it was just inevitable that people would take D&D to computers because the people who were in these fandoms overlapped with computer fandom. So the Plato system is what we usually point out as the progenitor of this. Plato obviously is based out of UIUC. It was a consortium of universities and military installations that were on a primitive early network, a real-time network. And this all went back to UIUC, to Illinois, where they had a supercomputer. By the time Plato 4, which is what this represents, was out, that was like a CDC 6400, I think, that actually managed all the terminals that interacted with it. But they had advanced multiplayer games for this in 1973. If you read Ted Nelson and people like that, you'll read his experiences going and playing on these systems, and you'll see everything we recognize from computer culture already being realized then. People that have aliases that they're known by in these games on their leaderboard. people that are out there, ganking, right? Very experienced players who are dominating newbies who try to get onto the system, and the trash talk associated with everything is already instantiated in a system like Play-Doh. And we think that the earliest graphical games that represented mazes where you went around and fought things seem to have been on Play-Doh. There's very few other real candidates, frankly, in 1975, which is when we have the earliest reports of these, where you could have a system like that. Your Altair could not do that in your home at that time. And this screenshots actually from the era are extremely rare from this. This is a screenshot from a game called Wizard from 1976, which is a little hard to come by. Where it gets even more fascinating, though, is in the story engines themselves. It's a professor, actually, a Stanford professor, Eric S. Roberts, computer science guy. He was at Harvard in the 70s, and he ran a campaign that was called the Mirkwood Tales, based on his homebrew version of D&D. And it had a few players in it, guys like Willie Crowther, Dave Lebling, who would go on to be principal architects of early computer games like Adventure and Zork. And when you read through the rules of the Mirkwood Tales, which Professor Roberts was generous enough to give to me when I was working my book, it really becomes kind of clear how you get to that, that dialogue between the player and the referee that we see in these early interactive fiction games. This, too, there had just been nothing like it, and it represents this intersection of the story concept of science fiction fandom, the game concept that we get from D&D and from the Mirkwood Tales, and then computers themselves, this remarkable confluence. And the shadow of D&D was quite long, though it's important to note, these games we're talking about were before D&D got like famous. The D&D fad really began in 1979 when this poor kid, James Dallas Egbert, disappeared from his university. And it was rumored that he was in these steam tunnels. Is this a familiar incident to all of you? People thought that he had gone crazy playing D&D, and he thought it was real, and he'd gone into the steam tunnels and in Michigan State University in East Lansing, gotten lost there, was probably dead. There's this private detective who came in to crack the case, who learned that Egbert had played D&D, and he developed this hypothesis. Obviously, D&D is a game that makes you go crazy. It's some kind of cult game. And this caused massive national publicity because this kid was missing for some weeks. And you see the New York Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, all reporting on this bizarre intellectual game, this cult game that college students were playing that was degrading their morals. And we might recognize Jack Thompson and the long shadow that has followed from that incident up to the present time. Of course, by the way, it turned out that the kid disappeared for completely unrelated reasons and had run away to Louisiana and eventually turned himself in. It had nothing to do with D&D. But that made it so popular that its domination of the three fandoms really completely transformed then. Between 1979 and 1983, it just had an unprecedented boom of success. And it was around that time that the first serious people started looking at games that were related to D&D. Lord British made many, many versions and BASIC on his Apple II of a game that eventually became Akalabeth. And Akalabeth, of course, was the precursor to Ultima 1. And Ultima 1 inspired many, many other titles, certainly informed things like wizardry. And by the time we got to Ultima 3, pretty much all JRPGs split off from Ultima 3, Dragon Warrior and Final Fantasy and so on. So really, the fruits of hobbyism, these people are just trying to figure out how to get that experience going, ended up being the early PC game industry. And if you go through the list of who the early companies were, look at things like Automated Simulations, who later became Epics. The founders met playing D&D here in Palo Alto. They made some war games like Invasion Orion, but quickly they got into the broader D&D simulation market. People like Avalon Hill, we talked about them and some of their board games. They got into this through microcomputer games. And people in Dave Arneson's circle formed this company called 4D Insys that ended up being a kind of a designer that was picked up by many publishers. Their games became very popular in the early industry. We could talk about Infocom. Dave Lebling was one of the founders of that, picking up Zork and so on. And there was just a tremendous mobility between the designers of these war games and role-playing games in the 1970s and computer development. Kalika was famous for poaching like half of the early protagonists behind D&D and the fanzines. People like Lauren Schick, people like Janelle Jacques all went there pretty early on. And to wrap up, since I know we're getting there, like I said, this is all, like I said at the beginning, this is all baby steps, okay? This is all small change. It's a pretty small step from Akalabeth and the story games that we see to get to WoW, to get to Skyrim, to get to Fallout 4, which I spent most of my vacation, winter vacation playing. There's a huge RPG industry. Fallout 4 is making $750 million the first day it comes out. I just had an experience of kind of what the next generation of this looks like in Utah a few weeks ago. I was at Sundance. There's like all of these VR things that are at Sundance. But I got dragged down to Linton, Utah to see this mixed reality VR game that's called Into the Void. And the Void, I guess, stands for the vision of infinite dimensions. When I say mixed reality, this is something where you wear your Oculus Rift with your Leap motion controller, and you move through a physical space. Every wall that you see in your Oculus Rift is a real wall that you can touch. And they've made a little maze. It's almost like a little dungeon. Kind of, it looks a lot like, that dungeon, right? And what they do is they just build in different visuals and confuse you and turn you around in ways that you never really know what the physical map is like. You'll come to places where there's an elevator where you stand, where it'll rumble under your feet and lift you up, and now you're in a different level of this, and you go back through the maze in completely different ways. I did a Mayan temple version of this. We were trying to find some secret in the Mayan temple. Again, I think even this, though, we're starting to figure out ways to experience the unreal more vividly than ever, right? And this, too, must just be baby steps. I think that the principles of simulation, the principles of story, the principles of getting real gamification around this kind of experience are going to make things available to us that we are not currently in a position to anticipate. And I think it's tremendously exciting. And the reason why I study history the way I do is because I think it's going to turn out to have been really important what these innovations were. What Reiswitz came up with in the early 19th century, or what was catalyzed by Dungeons and Dragons in the 1970s, because this is taking us into a cultural realm that I think is going to be very transformative for humanity. And it deserves all the scrutiny that we can give it. And that's my talk.